Thank you. Our webinar will start shortly as we allow people to get into the Zoom room. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Gina Neff, and I am the director of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Society, Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge. And I am delighted that you're joining us tonight for the launch of the book, Human-Centered Data Science, an Introduction. We have an exciting evening planned for this event. I'd like to invite our panel, our collection of fabulous people who are here this evening to join me on screen now. As we are doing that, thank you. Before I introduce them, I want to let you know that this event is being professionally live human captioned. If you'd like to have captioning, you can select it using the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. Also, there's a stream text captioning for this event that's available, and that's fully adjustable live transcription of the event will be in your browser. If you want to open this, the link is shared in the chat to this event. A transcript will also be made online, available after the event. So before we begin, a few points of housekeeping. The event is recorded by Zoom and streamed to an audience on the platform. By attending the event, you're giving your consent to be included in this recording. The recording will be available on the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy and the CRASSH websites shortly after the event. Our guests tonight, we will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion and take questions from the audience. And you can ask those questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. And I'll share those questions during our discussion. So please do not place questions in the chat. We're not monitoring the chat, but there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that for questions. We would very much appreciate if you could complete a short feedback questionnaire after the session, and the link to that will be sent via Eventbrite. Please follow us on Twitter and other social media platforms. Our address is @MCTD Cambridge. And you can use that if you're live tweeting tonight's event. So we're here to talk about human-centered data science. It's a new interdisciplinary field that draws from human-computer interaction, social science, statistics, and computational techniques. And tonight, ahead of the release of our book at the beginning of March, we'll talk about recommended approaches to addressing the bias and inequality that results from automated collection, analysis, and distribution of very large data sets. So our book, Human-Centered Data Science, an Introduction, offers a brief and hopefully accessible overview of many of the common statistical and algorithmic data science techniques, while explaining this human-centered approach to data science problems and presenting practical guides and real-world case studies to help readers apply these methods. So what does this mean? Well, we draw on well-established traditions of human-centered design to inform better data science practice. And we're trying to push computational approaches. Human-centered data science pushes these computational approaches to large-scale data to include the kind of rich detail, contextual knowledge, and deep understanding that qualitative research and mixed methods bring to the understanding of data in society. Now, my co-authors and I have helped to expand this field by writing about these practices, hosting workshops and tutorials to develop them with researchers, putting them into practice in our own projects, and teaching them in our classrooms. We would argue that this deep understanding of human and social contexts that shape data helps data scientists respond to ethical thinking and the choices they face in their everyday practice. So in our approach, data science is much more than, data ethics, is much more than simply a checklist. Human-centered approaches can help data scientists develop empathy for the subjects of their data, leading to greater acceptance and use of data science systems. And the decisions, this is important because the decisions that data scientists make, and they make into algorithms, may have unintended individual and social harms. And that's in part because data science has developed a significant power over human lives. And as data scientists, we have to think carefully about that power, its potential consequences, and our responsibilities to do something about it. And that's what we're here to discuss tonight. And that's what we're trying to do in the book. So with that, allow me to introduce my co-authors. We have Cecilia Aragon, professor, Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Shion Guha, assistant professor, Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. Marina Kogan, assistant professor, School of Computing, University of Utah. And Michael Muller, research staff member at IBM Research. Now, one of the things that was really important to all of us for this book was to make sure we bring in those real stories from the field and how people actually do data science. So we commissioned a series of case studies, and tonight we have with us Casey Fiesler from the University of Colorado, whose case study in the book explored the ethics of scraping data. So with that, I would like to turn our attention over to Casey. I think she will be sharing some slides. Casey.
Thank you very much. All right, just one moment. So I was asked to contribute a small part of this book related to the ethics of data scraping, which I actually think is a great topic for thinking about human-centered data science, because by the time data looks like a spreadsheet, it's very easy to lose track of the people in that data, particularly if the data was scraped in an automatic way such that you weren't necessarily engaging with the people in it. So in thinking about some examples to talk through this as an issue, one that came to mind that I know a lot of people are very familiar with was the algorithm that could determine from a photograph whether someone was gay or straight, predict from a photograph, I should say. And there was a lot of conversation about this particular thing that happened, mostly around whether this research was appropriate, what it was for, what the intention was. But something that I think got lost in it was how this research was done, because this required a massive amount of data. And where do you get a data set of people labeled with sexual orientation? From a dating site. And I think this is an interesting example of there being real people in this data that are, training algorithms, doing data science. And we sometimes lose track of them, even in the middle of a scandal or controversy about something else. We use data created by people that is public constantly. I mean, there's the number of papers that use Twitter data, for example, in a big data kind of way is just astronomical. And I'm not saying at all that any of this is bad, but that if you're going to make ethical decisions, there are a lot of different things you should keep in mind. But what I tend to hear is two things, whether it's a violation of terms of service and whether the data is public. And so a few years ago, my collaborators and I analyzed a whole bunch of terms of service, data scraping provisions. And what we found is that they don't give you a lot. They're completely context agnostic. The kinds of things you might think would matter for an ethical decision, like what's the data? What are you going to do with it? Who are you? What are the expectations of the users? None of this makes its way into terms of service, which then offers two issues with terms of service as an ethical thing. One is that it assumes it's inherently unethical to violate terms of service, which I would argue is not the case, in part because it's quite easy for to disallow data scraping and then no one else can study it, which one might argue is a problem. And also we've seen issues with, doing algorithmic audits to build out cases of discrimination, et cetera. But also terms of service is not the only thing that can make data collection unethical. Which brings me to my second one, is the data public, and the number of times I've heard this is even higher than the number of papers I've seen. A good example of this was someone released a data set of all of OkCupid without any anonymization at all. And then when out about this, the researchers said the data is already public. This is such a common term that my collaborator, Michael Zimmer, has a Google alert for the phrase data is already public. And this is a paper that he wrote about Facebook in 2010. I also did some research about how people feel about their data being used for consent. And the TLDR here is that most people have no idea that researchers are reading their tweets, and most think, well, that has to be against the rules. And I won't tell you anything about this chart except to say that it indicates that there are a lot of other things that matter than the publicness of the data. Lots of contextual things, including, for example, what the tweet is about. The idea that a tweet about what someone had for breakfast is equivalent and should be treated the same as a tweet revealing a sensitive medical condition is completely absurd. And so it's as a couple of more examples about this kind of thing. Another research project, YouTube videos of people going through gender transition were used to train facial recognition. And in a story about this, people indicated their surprise and alarm that they as a human were in this data set that might be used to create technology that could harm their community, when they had put themselves in a vulnerable position to share, not with researchers, but with other people in their community that they could help. My PhD students, Brianna and Shamika, have also studied how people in queer communities and Black communities feel about researchers using their data. And something that came up was people not understanding the community. We talk about positionality as researchers a lot in human subjects, how human subjects research, how are we going to interface with interview participants? We don't talk about it with data science, but I would argue that it's even more important, because if you're studying data without understanding that community and you're not talking to people, then positionality becomes important there as well. And so I will leave you with this really important point. It's inspired a little bit by the very first part of Reddit's community guidelines, which is remember the human. And I think it's really important that even when our data just looks like numbers, we are remembering the humans in the data. Thank you.
What a great note to launch on. Thank you, Casey. Next, I'd like to bring up Cecilia to talk a little bit about what human-centered data science is and a little context for the book. Cecilia.
So thank you, Gina, and thank you, Casey. So that was a wonderful case study that I think really illustrates what human-centered data science is, that we need to remember the human in the data. So thank you for making that so vivid, Casey, because that is so important. This is why in our book, we really wanted to focus on the real uses of how people are thinking about data and ethics and algorithms, because it's so complicated and you can often make it very abstract and focus too much on, well, this is an algorithm that has 91% effectiveness, and stop at that. And what we argue in our book and what we feel is incredibly important is that you simply cannot do that. We cannot afford to build the technology first and then worry about the ethical and societal implications later. Instead, we need to integrate a human perspective throughout data science. And so this is our goal, to reach out to young people, to older people, to everybody who is working on algorithms and data science and artificial intelligence, and say we need to think about the consequences of what we build. And so I'm going to start out by, I'm going to take a step back and talk about the genesis of this book. So all of us here on the screen have actually known each other for many years. We all are specialists in particular areas, but we all have concerns about the intersection of algorithms and data and the human. And let's see, I guess it was about 7 or 8 years ago that I'm a professor at the University of Washington in the eScience Institute, and Gina used to be there. And we got the idea, many of us here at the eScience Institute got the idea that it was important to think about what was then known as big data, what the impacts were, and what we needed to do to support this. And the issue that I brought up at the time was that let's not just think about the algorithms and how to develop more people that understand the technology, but also how to think deeply about the context, as both Casey and Gina brought up. Data is not separated, it's not cleaned, it's not unbiased. It lives in a world that is rich and complicated. And we need to think about this not at the end of the building of the algorithm, but from the very beginning of the design. And this was written into our proposal that we made to the Moore and Sloan foundations. And we started the data science environment that many folks were involved in, including people from NYU and Berkeley and really across the world. And as we did this work, it's slow, it's long work. It took many years over time. And this book was gradually born out of the work that we did in the eScience Institute, and also that everybody else did in their own environments. And I think it's becoming more and more clear in the world today the concerning consequences of algorithms that reinforce social biases, threats to our privacy, the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and even, as I think we are very aware today, of the weaponization of disinformation for use in cyber warfare that has tremendous impacts on human lives. So what we hope to leave you with this book is, it's wonderful to bring in ethicists and social scientists into your, data science company, but more than, you need to do that, but you need to not silo them. You need to listen to them. And somebody whose job is that of a data scientist needs to have some training and understanding of what the societal consequences of the work may be. And this is what we really hope this book will do, is that it'll make, it'll be a start. This is a complex and difficult topic. We try to make it accessible and hopefully easy to understand so that it can change and hopefully improve the world going forward. So thank you so much.
What a great note to transition on, Cecilia. Next, we have Shion, and Shion's in the lucky position where he's actually been able to teach part of the book in some of his classes. So Shion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gina. So I'll preface this by saying that and we have many objectives for writing this book. One of the main objectives for writing this book was to make sure that we are training the next generation of data scientists at both the undergraduate and graduate levels with these kinds of a human-centered lens, a human-centered mindset. And I used to be at a different university while we were writing this book. By the time this book was in the process to transition, I was hired at University of Toronto because guess what? They've been one of the first universities around to develop a program in human-centered data science. Looking at some of the folks in the audience, I can recognize a few of my student and colleagues' names. So I'm very happy to see y'all. But in the past couple of terms that I've been at U of T, I've really tried to shape the curriculum and nudge the curriculum towards the human-centered lens that we really talk about in our book. And I think that from the variety of feedback that I've received from students thus far, it's been wonderful. It's been very rewarding. I see a hunger amongst the next generation of data science students who want to go out there into industry and apply a human-centered lens to the kinds of work that they do. And perhaps it would be wonderful to get some questions from some of them who are currently in this program. But I think that we've seen early reinforcement of the idea that we did need a textbook like this. We did need some codified book where we could start training this next generation. I think this book can provide a variety of resources to not just human-centered data science undergraduate and graduate programs, but also lots of adjacent programs. There are a lot of institutions and universities all across the world that are opening up various kinds of professional programs that would definitely benefit from having such a book as this. So I'll leave off by saying that I've really enjoyed the last couple of terms at U of T, where even before this book was published, I've been able to make my students guinea pigs in trying to inculcate them with a human-centered lens. Thank you.
That is our plan, to take over the world, to indoctrinate our students into better data science practices. On that note, Marina has a really interesting perspective on who this book is for and kind of the vision that we had behind it. Marina?
Thank you, Gina. Yeah, Shion just talked about how important and necessary this book is for training the next generation of data scientists. And I completely agree. I see that in my own classes. I'm teaching a data wrangling class right now. And whenever I'm introducing any aspects of human-centered perspective in this class, emphasizing the humans behind the data, my students tune in so much more, right? They're so interested. There's such a demand for this. So this is certainly the case, and this is a big goal of this book. But I feel like the book also is necessary from the other perspective, from the social science perspective, in a sense. There's so many excellent books of critique out there about the potential harms and biases of data science and machine learning, of algorithms, the kinds of oppression they might impose on certain groups, or the kind of biases that they might perpetuate in certain societies, especially when historic biases are already encoded in the data. So that work has been done to some degree, and it's excellent work out there. However, most of that work has always been aimed at other social scientists, right? These are social scientists doing this work, doing the work of critique, and speaking to their own audience of other social scientists while doing that, which of course is very important, but I think it sort of stops in its tracks in terms of reaching a wider audience. So part of the work that we do with this book is try to translate this wonderful work, right? Translate the work of critique that has been done in accessible ways, so it's actually reachable. They could reach people who are practicing data science, who want to practice data science learners, and it doesn't sound like a bunch of social science jargon that's sort of, maybe feels to the practitioners oftentimes as kind of calling them out or blaming, but we actually trying to help them understand this critique, but also we move beyond critique in this book, right? And this is what makes me most excited about our book every time I talk about it, is how we are, I think, successfully combining this aspect of critique and translating it, but also moving beyond it and essentially offering concrete solutions, offering concrete methods or heuristics or advice about how to counter some of these biases, how to safeguard against some of these problems, how to consciously, from the beginning of your process, incorporate this human-centered perspective in what you do as a data scientist. And I think that's extremely necessary, and that's why I'm so excited about this book.
Thanks. Michael, you've got an interesting perspective on rallying around parts of this book.
I was muted, of course. Sorry. I'd like to talk about our own responsibilities in creating and perpetuating biases in data science. Nithya Sambasavan and colleagues recently wrote a paper called "Everyone Wants to Do the Model Work, Not the Data Work." And so in our book, we focus in part on the human activities that we all do in our data work, which is a necessary part of the socio-technical work of making a data set fit for purpose. In the book, we describe multiple ways that humans intervene between the data and the model. This awareness leads to our chapter called Interrogating Data Science, where we remind ourselves and others that humans change the data. We do this wrangling work under time pressure with the best of intentions, and our unexamined social biases can easily enter into how we discover, capture, clean, curate, and create the data. And of course, we must create the data when we make ground truth. Our effort is to bring these human activities into focus so that we can examine our choices, your choices, everyone's choices, and the biases that we inevitably object, and I might even say infect, into our data. We need to focus on these human socio-technical work practices in order to do better data science. We cannot remove bias, but we can become aware of the biases of ourselves and others, and we can adjust our practices accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, all of you. I guess I'll just add a couple of thoughts before I open up with some questions for all of us. I'm deeply humbled and honored that I got to be part of this incredible collaboration, including collaboration with our case study authors who, are really just a great list of extremely thoughtful people from different perspectives bringing to the book. And I saw a couple of things here. So I would be the one coming from what Marina said, the critic side. And what was great was sitting in parallel parallel writing, sitting next to one another, co-located in a lovely space in the University of Washington, where we locked ourselves in a room for an entire week to sit and write this book together to get the first draft started. And there were many things that surprised me. And one of the things that surprised me first was a completely different approach to computational problems, to social science problems. Social scientists say, okay, what question am I trying to ask? And how would I design a project? And I see Marina laughing, right? Because so many times in data science projects, you start with, here's the data. Now, what am I going to do with it? And one of the things we really tried in the book was not to throw that out. Certainly, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to basically say, okay, how are we asking thoughtful questions of data sets? And if we do that, then we're getting closer to the core of what a human-centered design approach might be. What problem are we trying to solve in the first place? And so, to Casey's point earlier in the evening, just because we can, just because the data are out there ready to be scraped, doesn't mean we should. Just because we might be able to ask a particular question of data doesn't mean it's actually the right question or the ethical question or the reasonable question to be asking. And then, Cecilia brought in this wonderful story of, the street lamp effect, right? The man loses his keys, but he looks under the street lamp for the keys, not across the street where he actually dropped his keys, right? He looks where the light is shining because the light's better. Data science can often be like that. And we use that metaphor in the book to kind of frame an arc to say many of these projects can be, well, we have the data, it's convenient. And so that's where we should be looking. But again, without asking those questions, is that getting us to the kinds of questions that we want answered? And then for me, I really care a lot about, I was trained as an organizational sociologist, and I really care a lot about this idea of the relationship between individuals and organizations. And that's something that I think has been missing around the conversation around data ethics and data practice, that there's been a real, I don't want to say simplistic, but I'm going to say simplistic on a Zoom call with 100 people on it. There's been a real kind of notion that if we want to make data science ethical, we just teach data scientists a 3-week module in their undergraduate degree on data science, how to be ethical, and that's it. Data science is now ethical. That we don't take into account that data science happens in organizations, it happens under pressures, just as Michael said, right? There's the human work of making data. And once we open that up and again, bring that sort of human-centered approach, that human-centered design approach to thinking about the problem of data science, like what would it mean to design data science from the ground up, then we start to see where power is, where people are, where different pressures are. And I think, to just echo Marina, it gets us to a very different place of putting into practice good and ethical practices, right? So we're no longer relying on, an individual within a system. We understand that it's systems that we need to be thinking about, its structures, its power. And we need to teach people to be attuned and aware to those. But we can't simply have those critiques. Those critiques are important. The wonderful work that we cite in the book, the really hard lifting around the importance of addressing biases in gender, in race, in sexual identity, in addressing problems of colonial power, the legacies of colonial power, in addressing kind of different and multiple worldviews and how Indigenous people around the world think about sovereignty and rights and data, bringing those perspectives together in a way that a data scientist can take on board. It was a huge challenge, and I think it's something that's really exciting about this book. The book will help us hopefully open new conversations with new people and conversations that have been going on in different places in new ways and bring them to different venues. So that's what I'm really excited about. While I'm bringing the questions up, and I'm going to urge everybody to put your questions in the Q&A bar that's at the bottom of your screen. I'll start looking through those, but perhaps I can open it up to any of my co-panelists who want to pipe in. You know, what surprised you either about the process of trying to work on this collaboration, or in Casey's case of working with us as part of the case studies? What did you find kind of useful about having the conversation about data science in this human-centered way? What have you learned? What have you learned? Or what has been surprising?
While others are gathering their thoughts, I might jump in. So because I have a background in both computer science and sociology, some of these concepts, I'm lucky enough to travel between these worlds in some way, right? Between this world of critique and this world of application, or more practical tools. And in some way, I have been unaware of my own privilege with respect to this. It's real, you know, trying to write this book in terms of translating the work of critique for others, for other people who don't have the social science background. I've realized how hard it is to do, and working together, that's been an incredible experience for me, because while I understand the social science concept, it doesn't necessarily mean that I was prepared to write about them for a more general audience, and specifically for data science audience. So I've learned so much from my co-authors in working on this book, and finding the ways to make these concepts accessible, right? Making these concepts maybe less cryptic or less jargon filled, and all of that, kind of getting at these really deep ideas that social science has worked on for hundreds of years, making them more available out there. So that was really hard, but also really, really rewarding.
In addition to that, someone from the audience has asked, have we seen any pushback? Is there some resistance to this kind of approach, and can anybody address that?
Yes, sure. I did a guest lecture at Boston University recently, and someone said, well, the data are the data, aren't they? And so why are you arguing against the data? As if the data had a separate existence. And I like to say, as if we were walking down the street one day and a perfectly formed data frame fell out of a tree on our head. And I think it's either Gina's or Cecilia's story that we make the data. The people who say the data speak through us don't understand how interpretation works, and how even the choice of what are the data, that's a human choice. That's a speech act in which we make certain things data and certain things not data. And it's really hard to persuade people who think that data have a separate existence from us, that data don't have a separate existence from us. We make the data.
Anybody else want to jump in on either of those surprising or making pushback, where pushback came from?
I'll jump in really quickly and just say, so I was trained as a mathematician and computer scientist and statistician. So I came from a very classic data science background. And I have to say that kind of so much of my own training was, what we do is the most important thing, and all that other stuff is soft, it's weak, it's not as good, it's not as important. And I will just admit that I started out thinking, if it was hard to write this software, it should be hard to understand, because that was part of my own training. And so maybe the pushback came from within me, and I had to really realize the error of my ways. And as soon as I did, here's what's truly amazing is, rather than being soft, rather than softening and weakening my work, it actually made it so much stronger. And my data science and machine learning and artificial intelligence work became so much stronger and more powerful and more effective when I started paying attention to the human-centered piece. So it is not that humans and rigor are two separate and contradictory things. It's super important to realize that. Instead, data science and computation becomes better and stronger and more rigorous when it is human.
That is beautifully said, and we thank Anna for posing that question on pushback. We have a question from Jude Clark, who asks, given that a lot of everyday data collection and analysis is derived for informal, unmanaged situations like marketing, politics, business, how do you see your book impacting on better practice? So given that these are less regulated areas, how do we make better practice?
Well, I think just to get us started, I think the point Cecilia was just making actually kind of answers that question to some degree, because at some point, even in these areas where maybe, people only maybe care more about results per se than the methods or the ethical dimensions of the methods, at some point, the efficacy of the methods will come through, or the lack thereof, right? That if we're not accounting for social context and we're trying to collect this political data, we might be missing a lot of nuance. We've had this happen with, presidential election polling and other aspects where, we can't really trust the predictions anymore because we're missing some of the nuance. We're not really considering different populations that are being polled, or how people respond to being polled in general, the effect of being interviewed, and how people might respond to survey questions in a way that they expect the interviewer wants them to respond. All these nuances of sort of social context play a role in how effective these methods are. And so I think at some point, sooner or later, people practicing these methods in various kinds of industries will probably realize that by accounting for these things, they actually produce better products, produce better outcomes.
Michael?
And I guess I'll say to Jude's point, and it's a very good point. I'm a big fan of regulation and regulated industries, but on the bleeding edge of things, it's up to us to do the ethical things, because inevitably society will lag behind what we are doing. And it's up to us to hold up the problems and to say, look, this can go wrong. This can go bad. You could do things you never imagined you would do to someone unless you're careful. So it's on us first, and then subsequently it's on us to lobby our legislators and regulators and help them to help all of us do better.
And I guess I would just add too that, one of the things that struck us, we didn't want an ethics chapter of this book. We felt pretty strongly about that. And our reviewers had a different opinion. They said, where's the ethics chapter? I don't see it in the table of contents. But we wanted to have, and again, I think this is, I thank my my co-authors who are centrally in the human-centered design, human-centered engineering field, that in part because you are so attuned to this idea that you solve problems based on a context with a set of tools rather than a checklist. This is ethical, this is unethical. You have a framework for approaching the problem. And so I would say to Jude's question, one of the things we're trying to do is help people understand that this kind of way of approaching data science can be better if we remember how data are always implicated in a set of human contexts and human relationships. So
I'd like to add quickly, the ethics chapter is the book.
yes. Thank you, reviewers who pointed that out for us on our proposal. I'm going to jump a little bit to the last question on the Q&A, and forgive me, I don't have my glasses, so I can actually read your name, but the question, thank you, thanks us for writing the book and being looking forward to doing it. And it's like, the question is, what are the perspectives on how viewing and handling the same data might be in different parts of the world, guided by local cultural practices? How do you address the nuances of cultural difference in the book?
I can take that. So I think that we have consistently pointed out in the book that human-centeredness is always local and very culturally contextual. And throughout the book, in the variety of chapters, we've provided practical suggestions, guides, little nudges about what you as a practitioner could potentially do, keeping in mind your local cultural practices and tradition. And what that means is very different things, right? It could mean different diversity in the data science team that's handling the data. It could refer to a specific part of the world where you were at, where there are different norms, perceptions, and values for how data are handled. But it could also mean the relationship between, what senior leaders are telling you to do and what you think you should be doing. So we've consistently tried to point this out, that we shouldn't really be in the business of prescribing a one-size-fits-all model. And precisely for that reason, it is also impossible for us to enumerate all of the various approaches that different parts of the world or different kinds of organizations or different kinds of groups, communities with relationships and values that are divergent from one another could look at data. But we've pointed this out, that this is not a human-centeredness, doesn't mean that there's a one-size-fits-all solution. A very good recent example of this that I love to point out, and I think I've ranted about this to my students already, is in the COVID-19 pandemic. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, everyone wanted to build global models of COVID case predictions. And guess what? All of those models are wrong. They were never useful. Most of them did not predict COVID deaths or infections or cases or hospitalizations in the ways that they should be doing. It is impossible to build, and I will fight with everyone about this, it is impossible to build a global COVID-19 model for, let's say, the United States or Canada or India or China. You can't do it. But what can you do? Can you do it for a more locally relevant area? Could you do it for, let's say, what's happening in parts of Massachusetts? Could you do it for a healthcare system that's in rural Indiana? Could you do it for among indigenous populations in Northern Canada? Yes, you can. You can build locally contextual models. And we've pointed this out a lot throughout the book, that this is important. And what I should point out is, we've also made the distinction that we're not, by definition, human-centered data science is not model-centered data science, it's human-centered. And so that points out that, we should be taking into account, all of these relevant issues. Anyway, I just want to mention that. Hope, Ramaravind, that gets at your question. Thank you.
Michael, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure, I can't resist, can I? I'm thinking we did list a very few. I'm thinking in my part of North America, there are 567 nations, tribes, and bands of native people, and that's not including Alaska. In Shion's part of North America, I think it's more than 600. We can't list all of their distinctive and virtuously ethical ways. We did make reference to Inui Kaujimajatu Kanri, which is an ethical set of principles from Nunavut. And we did quote the fourth declaration of the Wakandan jungle, we want a world in which multiple worlds exist. So those are directions, but that doesn't mean that this book is an exhaustive cultural catalog. Couldn't do that.
And I think we were also we were aware that we wanted the book to translate across an international audience in ways. So we did try to pay attention to that, even though we overwhelmingly represent in some ways or other North America more than others. We have a question, and we are getting close to our end of our question time. So if you have a question, please pipe into the Q&A down below. Tyler asks us to explain the reasoning behind choosing the term data science rather than machine learning. It seems like we do a lot with machine learning in the book, but why use the term data science instead of human-centered machine learning? Does data science imply something broader?
So I'll jump in with that as someone who's done a lot of machine learning and data science. Yes, you cannot do machine learning without data science, but you can do data science without machine learning. I mean, really, all these terms overlap: artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science. What they all have in common is they all are going to use very large data sets. So we feel that data science is really the broadest term, and really the one that's the most critical, because as Casey pointed out so clearly and well, that data are people, right? I mean, all data is human, and we really wanted to focus on that and counter the common view that, oh, data is scrubbed of human influence. It is unbiased. So that's why we brought it up.
I want to piggyback on that just very shortly to say that so many human decisions go into organizing the data, cleaning the data, and all of the other messy data wrangling stuff you have to do before you can apply any machine learning model or any other kind of model to the data. I've been teaching this data wrangling class to the data science undergrads for the third time this semester, and we're seeing that so clearly in every turn of this class, right? How many human decisions go into how are you going to deal with these missing values, right? Am I going to delete this entire column? Am I going to impute the values? How? There's so many choices that an analyst would make. And this is still dealing with the data and the fact that data is representing people. So before we even get to the sort of modeling part of machine learning, there's a lot of work that's human defined.
That's great. We have one more question. I think we have time for one more. Audrey Gouchard asks us if we were inspired by Helen Nissenbaum's notion of contextual integrity. And Nissenbaum demonstrated that data being public doesn't mean data being up for grabs because of the inherent contextual nature of data. And if we've been influenced by this work, how could we explain? And I think all of us would have perspectives on that, and perspectives on the idea of data and context. And I see Casey nodding too. Casey, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an astute observation of the importance of context, and contextual integrity in particular as a framework makes a lot of sense here. In fact, I would say, so one of the small case studies that I brought up was the OkCupid data set, and Michael Zimmer, who I also mentioned, wrote a great paper, I think it's in Social Media Plus Society, analyzing that case as a way of thinking through how contextual integrity as a framework would work for research ethics. And I've certainly seen, I mean, I think sort of like remember the human in the data thing is actually a lot about context, and that's a good word for a lot of what I've seen in this book as well.
Cecilia, do you want to jump in on context and humanness?
Yeah, so I mean, Nissenbaum's work was really important to us. It was one of the texts I think we've all read and that influenced our thoughts as well. I know I've been using the concept of contextual integrity even before we started writing this book. It was one of the first, when I think back to a time about 15 years ago, when I first started working in data science and was introducing human-centered data science to some of the more hardcore scientists I was working with, I brought up this term and I used these arguments to show how this changed the data and how it changed the results. And I think that contextual integrity is a wonderful term that is accessible to people outside the social sciences. And by using these types of explanation, it's a wonderful way really to explain to scientists that need to be persuaded by pure logic. So yeah, all the work we're doing is building on a mountain of tremendous work that's been done by many really smart and deep thinking people. So we do give credit to all of them in the book.
Thank you. Thank you all. And what a note to end on. Thank you. As I said, I'm really honored that MCTD, our new center, was able to host this event. I'm so grateful to my co-authors and my co-panelist, Casey. Thank all of you for joining us tonight. The details of the future events from the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy can be found on our website, and that's www.mctd.ac.uk. I'd like to just mention too, we are helping to host an event, Does AI Advance Gender Equality? And that's our next event on the 8th of March. That's International Women's Day. And that's a report that we helped to co-author with the OECD, UNESCO, and the Inter-America Development Bank. So that should be a really interesting event. There's also 2 events open for registration on Monday through the Cambridge Festival. And this is a way to open up the university to broader conversations and broader communities. And those events will open for registration next Monday, including an event on mis and disinformation and a interesting data walk through Cambridge for those of you who will be joining us in geographic space. I'd also like to say that there's a possibility that we will have a splashy event at the end of March around data and data ethics. Stay tuned for that on our website if that is coming through. And again, let me just please continue following us on Twitter and other social media platforms at MCTD Cambridge. Thanks again, everybody. And please, with the last 2 minutes that we have, if I could bring my co-panelists back in, if you have 20 seconds to say to the future students, this is what you should do, go do it. I'll start with Cecilia. Cecilia, I'll put you on the spot. Charge to the future.
So I think the students today that I work with already know the direction they want to go in. And why we wrote the book is to help give them tools, to help give you, all of you, tools to be more effective in the path, the very ethical and thoughtful path that you have taught me so much in. So hopefully I can give something back. Hopefully we can give something back. And thank you so much.
Anyone else? Charge to the future.
If I may, I've seen in our nascent human-centered data science graduate program, as Cecilia pointed out, most of the next generation are actually quite cognizant of these issues. And just as a passing note, I was looking at the numbers for our admissions, and I was like, astounded to see that in barely the second year of the program, there's 700 odd applications for just a few positions. And every time I speak to a prospective student or a current student, I'm just amazed at how much consciousness that they have. I was a theoretical statistician not that long ago. I certainly never learned anything about human-centeredness. Everything I learned about human-centeredness has been with my colleagues, but I feel like the next generation is already most of the next generation is already well geared to do human-centered data science. And I'll just end with the fact that you should always create good trouble wherever and whenever you are.
That's a great note to end on. We dedicate the book to our students because you all have inspired us, and you continue to inspire us for the work that you do to make data science better. So on that note, thank you all for joining us tonight, today, wherever you are in the world, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much.